Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode in the series, The Cross Questioned. And as we looked at last week, we had a look, at this point we've got to the point where we are now going back, revising everything that we have learned so far and looking in more detail at each topic. But before we do that, we have been looking at the crucial step in the process of establishing the authenticity of the crucifixion itself and determine if the Prophet Isa, as found in Islam, or Jesus Christ, as found in Christianity, was indeed put on that cross. Now, the Gospels itself, as we have seen, provide us only a very sketchy and not a very stable and oftentimes very blurred and contradictory version of what actually happened during the crucifixion scene. So much of the crucifixion scene, the Easter weekend, is up to faith, because the evidence that we have looked at up to this point is not one that we would say is credible. When preparing this series of talks, I actually sent my talk to, or the notes that I had, I sent them to 3 different people. I sent them to a high court judge in my country who is a Muslim. So I'm exposing that he wasn't a Christian, but he's actually a Muslim. He looked at it. I gave it to a Christian man who investigates crime. That's his job. He's one of the most respected investigators, police investigators in my country. And I gave it to a law professor. And I asked them to have a look if the information that is entailed and contained inside this document is perhaps biased, or is it an accurate reflection? And the notes that I got back were astounding, because not only did they understand where I was going with the series, but they gave me more information than I would have thought of looking at myself, because they were looking at it from a way of a detective. They were looking at it from a way of a high court judge. They were looking at it from a way of a lecturer at a university who teaches law. So they said that these sources that we have in the New Testament, all 3 of them agreed. Only one was a Muslim, the other 2 were not Muslim. All of them agreed that they would have been thrown out of court with insufficient evidence. So we have a problem, because the information that we have is dubious at times. So we need to seek, oftentimes, alternative sources independent of the New Testament to establish the true perspective. But the problem is that these sources have been destroyed systematically over the years, and those sources that we do have left are ones that are unacceptable to Christianity, or if they are acceptable to Christianity, they're unacceptable to the rest of humanity. So we have a problem that much of the source material is not acceptable. So we are left again with what I started off at the beginning of this talk today, is saying it's up to faith, because there is no evidence and there is nothing else that we can use. However, if you choose to believe this scenario purely by faith, well, this is the reason for the series, to poke holes into just blindly following without having evidence. So my job is to make you question why you believe what you believe. And so last time we looked at Judas the Iscariot as possibly one of the candidates that could have just as easily be crucified or to be put on the cross as it would have been for Jesus himself to have been put on the cross according to Christian doctrine. So in this series that we have got to this point thus far. And today we are going to look at candidate number 2. There are 3 candidates, we said, and we said that we're only going to be dealing with 2 in the series, because the 3rd candidate, being Simon, is one that we're going to look at a future series all on its own. But I asked you last time to have a look at what you can find out about the character Barabbas. Remember, in the narrative, we were told that there were 2 choices that the people had to make. They could either release Barabbas, or they could release Jesus the Christ. And the people chose to release Barabbas according to the narrative. Now, according to Mark chapter 15 and verse 7, it says, "And there was one named Barabbas, which lay hold of them, and they had made captive because of insurrection that he had committed, and he had committed a murder in this insurrection." So according to Mark's version, in Mark chapter 15, verse 7, there was a certain man by the name of Barabbas who had been part of an insurrection, an uprising, and he had committed a murder. Where was this uprising taking place? It was taking place against the Romans. So he was obviously a Jew who was involved in an uprising. Remember that the Jews were under captivity. They were surrounded by the Romans, and the Romans were controlling the area. And so these Romans were basically masters over these people. Even though they had certain rights and freedoms, Rome was very smart in doing this. Often when they would capture a land, they would still allow the people to continue worship in their day-to-day life, as long as they didn't cause an insurrection against the people or fight against the existing government that was now in place. So this man was known to be, according to Mark chapter 15, verse 7, a murderer. He had killed Roman officials. We don't know if it was one or two, whether it was a Roman soldier, whether it was a Roman official. For some reason, he was known to be a murderer and part of this insurrection, and he was under arrest and sitting in a jail. Now, in Matthew's version, in Matthew chapter 27, verse 16, it calls this man a man of some notoriety. In other words, he was a very known person. He wasn't somebody who was just in jail and nobody knew who he was. Even those people who didn't know who Jesus was would have probably known more about Barabbas. He was probably known more than Jesus was known, because Jesus was lesser known in certain areas than he was. So even in Matthew chapter 27, verse 16, it says that he was a man of some notoriety. So Mark said he was a murderer. Matthew says he's a person of known notoriety. Luke says and describes him that he was a certain man who caused sedition in the city, and he had committed a murder, and that he was cast into prison. Luke chapter 23, verse 19. And John, being the fourth gospel, his version tells us plainly that Barabbas was a thief or a robber or a bandit. He doesn't go into much more detail than that. And we find that in John chapter 18, verse 40. So we got murderer, a well-known man, and a robber. Doesn't matter what he was, because it really doesn't make any difference for our argument that we're looking at this point. Now, Barabbas was a notorious, seditious criminal who perhaps committed a murder. So I put all four of the versions in one sentence. And he was known by the Romans as a person who caused an insurrection. There's no debate on this. Both the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews and the Hindus and the Buddhists reading this text will all agree with what I just said. He was a known person who has caused insurrection. Now, if we look on the other hand, there is this other man who is also being brought before the people at this time, where they've been offered whether you want to have Jesus released or whether you want to have Barabbas released. And if we look at Jesus, he is known simply for the following. He's known to be a preacher. He's known to be a person who is kind. He's known to be a person who raises the dead and helps the sick and the poor. He reaches out to the Jew and to the Gentile. He respects authority. Even if we read Mark chapter 12, we see that in Mark chapter 12, it says that when he spoke publicly, he said, "Pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's." In other words, he was telling people, pay your taxes. Do not fight against the Roman authority. He never once picks up weapons or fights or says to the people, we need to liberate ourselves from these captors. No, in fact, he teaches peace and respect and tells people to submit, not to fight, but to be submissive. So Pilate was concerned by looking at this man when he brought these two people. He looks at these two people and he sees on the one hand Jesus and on the other hand Barabbas. Now you can put yourself, as my three friends did in South Africa. They come from three different faculties of life and different ways of studying. And they looked at it in the same way. Pilate was concerned with this case that had been brought before him, because it was brought before him by the Jews themselves on two different counts. The charges were charge number one, sedition, and charge number two, blasphemy. Now Pilate was already satisfied. He had satisfied himself that there was no case for sedition. He wasn't trying to claim, as far as he could see in the questioning that he did, that Jesus did not once claim to be an earthly king. He did not claim to lead an army. He did not claim to be equal to the existing authorities on earth or in Palestine at that time. So he does not have any charge that he can find that even slightly hints to the fact that Jesus has committed a crime that as a Roman pagan he would find offensive. Nothing that broke the law. Nothing that would demand any type of punishment, let alone a flogging or even a crucifixion. What about the second charge? Well, he's a pagan. He doesn't care the slightest if Jesus claims to be the tooth fairy, whether he claims to be the Son of God, or if he claims to be God himself. He does not care. He is a pagan. It wouldn't matter, because there were many people walking around at that time calling themselves God or Son of God, or calling themselves to be demigods. He was used to meeting people like this. In his own culture, it was prevalent. His own political leader was classified as a god. So it was quite normal for him to see it. So there was nothing there either. So on two accounts, there's nothing. Could Pilate send this innocent man, this law-abiding man, this man who had only done good, to death in a hurry when sedition and murderous revolt and terrorism and other crimes and theft were laid on the person who was now sitting in prison waiting for trial, and that is the man that has been offered to the people? Which one would you rather have to be released, Jesus or Barabbas? And so Barabbas, who is a known terrorist, he is on the FBI's top 10 list in the day. He had killed a Roman official. Do you really believe that this man, who had caused an uprising, that Pilate indeed would come across and say, okay, because you gave me a little bit of pressure, let me let this man go? We're going to take a break, and when we get back from the break, we will continue, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Yasir Fazaga, wishing you and your family a happy Ramadan.
Dialogue. Discussion. Debate. Rebuttal. Conclusion.
Eliminate misconceptions about religion. Get enlightened.
Witness Dr. Zakir Naik in a battle of words in Crossfire every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 7:30 a.m. India on Peace TV.
What are the main characteristics the callers to Islam need to succeed? The key to success in dawah and akhirah are good characteristics and excellent manners. Patience, sacrifice, mercy, forgiveness, and overlooking of faults. Ikhlas, taqwa, and nasiha. What do these mean? And how do we attain them? To find out more about these qualities, join me, Abdurrahim Green, in my series Characteristics of the Caller, here on Peace TV.
Discover those specific values that attract people towards Islam in Characteristics of the Caller to Islam. Every Wednesday at 9 p.m. and repeat telecast at 9 a.m. India on Peace TV.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back from the break. We are continuing looking at the possibility that Jesus, peace be upon him, was not put on the cross by looking at the text of the Bible. The crowd is shouting, "Set Barabbas free, set Barabbas free." And he's looking at the situation thinking, well, Barabbas, according to the text, is a terrorist. He is on the wanted list. He is somebody who is lying in the prison there for causing sedition. He has been causing an uprising. He is a known felon, a known terrorist, who is telling people to kill the Romans, and in the sake of killing the Romans, we will free our people, the Jews, from captivity. Do you believe that they would have allowed him, the Roman, let alone what the Jews would want, to allow this terrorist to go free? And yet Jesus, who was telling the people to pay taxes, to not fight against the Romans, to turn the other cheek if you're struck, to walk the extra mile if asked to. Where does this walk the extra mile come from? The Romans had the right in those days to stop a Jewish inhabitant and to compel that Jewish inhabitant to carry a package, a load, whatever it is, for 1 mile. They, by law, were not allowed to make you carry it more than 1 mile. So what does Jesus tell his followers and all those who are listening? He says, when a Roman makes you carry a package 1 mile, carry it another mile for him. Does this sound like a person you want to have out of the scene as a Roman? This is the person you want to make a minister of public affairs or foreign affairs, not somebody you want to get rid of or kill. However, when we look at Barabbas, this is a man who is known for causing a riot, known for trying to uprise against the Roman officials. And yet we are led to believe that Pilate indeed had cowered down and passed the sentence of death against Jesus merely because the people gave him a threat, as found in John chapter 19 verse 12, where it is said, "If you let this man go, you are not a friend of Caesar. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." This is what the people are saying. Do you believe that this Roman official would have cared two hoots what they said about that? If they said, "You are no friend of Caesar if you let this man live because this man says that he is a king." Didn't he already discover that there is no charge against him? He never claimed to be an earthly king. Did he never claim that his kingdom is of this earth? And then, out of absolute fear and terror of the people that he was in power over, that he was in control over, that somehow he says, okay, you know, too much pressure. Let me put this man to death and let me let this terrorist go out into the streets, cause an uprising, cause more problems, and we can possibly lose the whole country because of it. Such a person would not dare even consider releasing a revolutionary terrorist known to murder Roman officers or Roman officials. We don't know if it was Roman officers or Roman officials, but we know it had to do with Rome. And this was the time that we look at in history where there was great unrest in Judea and along the borders of Judea. So there is no way that we can sit here in the 21st century. Put yourselves in the shoes of the people in those days and think, would you do it? Being a legal person, perhaps you're a lawyer sitting at home watching, or a judge, or perhaps you're an American. This will be even closer to home to you. Would you release somebody who had been caught for a terrorist act? Even though you had another person here who claimed to be the Messiah and he was walking around New York saying he's the Messiah, which one would you release? You would release the guy who claimed to be a Messiah without even thinking twice. So when we look at this revolutionary, this person, we are told to believe somehow that he was released. King Herod, who had not been in good terms with Pilate, he himself would not condemn Jesus. He was not a Roman. He was not a pagan. He was a Jew who had advisors who were Jews. And these advisors would have told him, listen, put him to death. But when he looks and makes his judgment, he says, I can find nothing wrong with him. It could not have been good politics to condemn Jesus merely because he wanted to please the chief priests and the crowds to release Barabbas, a known outlaw. It was bad politics. What do you think the Romans would have thought of this man? Do you think that he would have held on to his position for much longer? They would have come and they would have arrested him in the middle of the night and they would have killed him. Because he is now giving authority for this man to be released. In any case, there is no evidence of there being a tradition anywhere in any time of a release of a prisoner at the time of the Passover. Even in those days, even in now, nowhere in Jewish history and nowhere afterwards in later Christian history. That never happened. So let us consider, if we will, now that I've shown you that it's impossible that it happened, but we are going to be those people with blinkers on. We're going to say, but we have faith. We have to believe the narrative by faith. Even though you can prove that it didn't happen, we have to be blind and just go on anyway. So let us consider a possible alternative. Pilate being sure of Jesus' innocence. Both him and the Jewish counterpart are both convinced that Jesus is innocent and did not want to release him. So he declares him innocent. And what he does is he simply sends him off to be flogged, to be whipped, so as to show that the punishment has been done and that he has done what he is supposed to do. And so when he brings him back to the crowd still are not satisfied. Having failed to satisfy the priests that were there, maybe the crowd is still continuing. He went straight to the crowd and offered to release Jesus as a generosity act of clemency and forgiveness at the so-called event that always happened, but we never see it happening ever again. When this failed and everything else failed, he brought in the notorious criminal Barabbas and put him before the crowd. Now, you can imagine that they are not going to release this criminal, not a chance. So perhaps the following scenario takes place. Instead of releasing Barabbas, they actually release Jesus. And they take Barabbas and they put a crown of thorns on him and seat him in a seat where they whip him and lash him and all the other stories that we hear in mythology and Christianity, and put a robe around him. And then they sentence him to be crucified without a crowd even noticing what had happened. Now you might say, well, very unlikely. Well, the chief priests and the Pharisees, who were those people that were around at that time, were nowhere near the actual instance, the incident that was taking place. Because as it says in John chapter 18, verse 28, they were not able to enter the courtyard for fear of defilement. So they didn't see what happened. They just take it on the word of the Romans that he was crucified, that Jesus was actually crucified, and that Barabbas was released. And if you were Barabbas at the time, you're going to head for the hills when you're released, because there's going to be a hit squad after you. The Romans will find a way to kill you somewhere, somehow. So he would have run for the hills. So it would have been quite acceptable for no one to have seen Barabbas and for them to believe that he would have just disappeared. So from a distance, it may not have been possible for even those in the crowd that were there who were shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him," to recognize this condemned person. We know from the Bible that those people that were there stood at a distance and were not near, even the disciples themselves, as we read from the text. Now, curiously, this bandit, where I asked you last time to find out what is the real name. Ask your priest, go Google it. What is the real name of Barabbas? Barabbas's full name, are you ready for it? Was Jesus Barabbas. And the local language of the time, if you translate the name Jesus Barabbas in the Aramaic, it means the Son of the Father. So if Pilate was to give the choice to the crowd and say to the crowd in Aramaic, which is a language they spoke, Jesus, the Son of the Father, should be released, or should I release Jesus, the Son of the Father? Do you understand what I just said? He was offering them the choice between Jesus, the Son of the Father, or you can choose between Jesus and the Son of the Father. Now, the crowd was in no mood to go and try to rationalize whether it was a capital S for the second or a small s for the first. And so, not interested in this, they simply shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him," is exactly what we hear in the text. They don't say, "Can you explain what you mean, because you've offered us two of the same names or two of the same titles." And so it is quickly passes this sentence of fear of them detecting his little trick by bringing up both exactly the same names and calling Barabbas by his first name. Well, that's all the time we have. Next time we are going to look at, did Jesus in fact die on the cross, and look at another theory that we're going to come up with, inshallah. So, and for me, Areeb Islam, until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.